Looking at the opposition to the Mexican-American War, some of the quotes from some of the primary sources in the time leading up to and including the war are some notable names such as Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln. And so, talking about the annexation of, and this is supposed to be Texas, not Mexico, the annexation of Texas. Remember that Texas had declared independence and seceded from Mexico, which the government of Mexico objected to. Now, the Americans were sympathetic, at the very least, to this because of the Declaration of Independence. That being said, the next issue was the issue of the annexation of Texas, which is the somewhat more peaceful territorial takeover or the guardianship, the bringing of Texas under American territorial control. Now, this, in many people's minds, and certainly in the minds of the Mexican government, would have been considered an act of usurpation or an act of war. Leading up to the Mexican-American War, Henry Clay expressed just this sentiment. In this first quote here, he said, annexation, basically the takeover of Texas into American territory without the agreement of the Mexican government. Annexation and war with Mexico are identical. Now, for one, I am certainly not willing to involve this country in a foreign war for the object of acquiring Texas. But I do not look upon this lightly. I regard all wars as great calamities to be avoided if possible, and honorable peace is the wisest and truest policy of this country. Annexation would be to proclaim to the world an insatiable and unquenchable thirst for foreign conquest or acquisition of territory. I consider the annexation of Texas at this time, without the assent of Mexico, as a measure compromising the national character, involving us certainly in a war with Mexico. And so what Henry Clay is saying there is he makes a couple points, a couple arguments about this issue of annexation of Texas and the likelihood that it will lead to war with Mexico. His first point is that he believes that the takeover of Texas by the United States, when Mexico has not agreed with Texas's secession from Mexico, will be seen as an act of war, an act of aggression by the Mexican government. So he says these two things are identical. He says, and then he goes on and said that he was not willing to bring the United States into war simply with a foreign country, losing lives, killing, and dying for the object of acquiring Texas. Is really Texas worth sending Americans to fight and die and kill in an international war? Is it really worth it? Then he also goes on and says that he regards all wars as great calamities to be avoided if it's possible, meaning unless there's an attack or of self-defense. But he goes on and says his next point that annexation, what is that going to say? Annexation and then basically war with Mexico. What would that say about the United States? Well, according to Henry Clay, he said annexation would be to proclaim to the world an insatiable and unquenchable thirst for foreign conquest or acquisition of territory. Basically, it would communicate to the United States, communicate about the United States to the rest of the world, the reputation of conquest, taking over an area by war and force, just like the governments of Europe and empires all around the world have done for centuries, fighting wars in order to gain territory. And he also goes on and says that he considers annexation of Texas at this time. So he's saying, look, the issue of whether or not Texas eventually joins the United States is not the issue necessarily. He says at this time, without the assent of Mexico, basically against the wishes of the Mexican government, he says, as a measure compromising the national character, meaning this is a blight on America's reputation and involving us certainly in a war with Mexico. They're risking war simply for this action, and war eventually happened. Now, Abraham Lincoln also expressed his disagreement with the Mexican-American War. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, a younger Abraham Lincoln in the House of Representatives, even introduced what was called the Spot Resolution, that when Polk made his request for war with Mexico before Congress declared war, Abraham Lincoln introduced the Spot Resolution, saying, where did this attack of the Mexican army against American troops take place? Because, in all likelihood, and it would turned out to be true, that it took place in a disputed territory where American troops were there to provoke an attack, waiting to be attacked so that there would be a justification for war. But Polk, after having heard this, made the case before Congress and before the American people, by extension, that Mexico had invaded the United States and shed American blood on American soil. Lincoln argued, though, for not only the Spot Resolution, but he also argued that it was the right of Texas to become independent of Mexico, arguing the same logic as the Declaration of Independence. Now, ironically, later on, Lincoln will be president, and this issue will come up again during his presidency, when several southern states, including Texas, will try to exit the United States, and the Civil War will be fought to prevent that from taking place and being maintained. But Lincoln said in a speech in 1848, any people anywhere being inclined and having the power have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world. Nor is this right confined to cases in which the whole people of an existing government may choose to exercise it. Any portion of such people that may revolutionize and make their own of so much of the territory as they inhabit. It's a very interesting quote from Lincoln, a pro-secession quote, a pro-independence quote regarding Texas separating from Mexico. He says any people have the right, and he believed that this sacred right, as he called it, would be the right that would liberate the world, that it would limit the authorities of governments, that people would be able to separate from a government they were unhappy with and rule themselves under a government they believed suited them better. And that even a portion of a people could choose to exercise it, even if the full government did not agree with it. Interesting argument. Lastly, William Goodall, who's a journalist at this time, writing in. I believe this was a newspaper, but I may have that wrong. But anyway, spoke about the connection between the Mexican-American War and slavery. Now, slavery, initially, when you read this, history or hear the history of the Mexican-American War and study it out, it doesn't seem at first glance that it has anything to do with slavery. However, this boldness of the United States government to acquire territory by these means, below the line drawn after the Missouri Compromise, which, remember, if you remember, during the Missouri Compromise, Missouri was going to throw off the balance of slave states and free states. And the compromise was they drew a line, they added one more free state so that they stayed even, and further conflict was avoided at the time. But below the line, slave states could continue to come into the Union and exist. Above the line, new free states could come into the Union and continue to exist. Now, this boldness for acquiring the territory of Texas from Mexico by annexation further encouraged the boldness of some who thought that by the arm of the US government, they could acquire more territory that would be slaveholding territory, states, and add to their power in the power balance in the Union. So William Goodall expressed this following point. He said, the successful annexation of Texas in 1845, which would come in as a slave state, said, encouraged the slaveholding party in Congress to broach openly the project of entering into negotiations for the cession of Cuba. Their papers began to dwell on the importance of adding California to the United States, and President Polk was evidently determined to obtain that province either by negotiation or war. A couple interesting things here. Texas added a huge set of territory to the United States. It added another large slave state, and it also encouraged others to think that within the international conquering of territory, below the line drawn by the Missouri Compromise, which means that it could be slave territory, add more senators, add more representatives to Congress, and therefore shift the balance of power in the Union, they started to look toward Cuba, the small-ish island off the coast of Florida. Think about that Cuba could be ceded as land and eventually territory and state of the United States. And then California would be added as well. In fact, it was the result of the Mexican-American War that California was added to the territory of the United States, and it would eventually become a state in 1850. Californians in California were actually rebelling against the Mexican government and wanted to become independent. So many were all too happy to allow the United States in, and once they got to Los Angeles, and separate officially from Mexico and join the United States as a territory and eventually become an official state. That being said, California in 1850, there would be another conflict because California would come in as a free state. So there's this continual shifting of the balance of power between slave states and free states, slave territory and free territory, that's impacting the United States as it moves inevitably toward civil war. And so Goodall explains that, in his opinion, President Polk was ready to get California and this other territory either by negotiation or war. Eventually, it's a little bit of both. The war made the negotiation inevitable, and the shape of the United States owes quite a bit to the Mexican-American War. But there were several voices, and these are just a sample of those who were against the war and opposing the war in that time. It's interesting to read through and listen to their arguments.